Welcome to Food on the Mind. This is your host, Jeb Stewart Johnston. I'd like to invite you to head on over to the website if you get a chance. It's at www.foodonthemind.com. Sign up for the newsletter. Grab your free mindful eating guide. You can even set up a consult call with me. Kind of talk about whatever it is you want to talk about. But mainly for me to help you get better at helping yourself. And now, without further ado, here's our next guest. I mean, I think that's a good sell.
This is a great beard you got going, Jim.
I grow beards in the winter, but now that I'm in South Carolina, it doesn't actually make sense.
Never cold. Yeah.
It was like 30 this morning, so like it actually was,
okay.
It's like out of sheer laziness, like and the other thing is because I get in trouble if I trim it because beard hairs end up everywhere in the bathroom. My wife goes, "It's like this is disgusting." So I'm actually better just to go shave it completely off outside at some point when it's warmer, and then just keep it short. So yeah, that's my technique.
I like it. Yeah.
It's like your progeny, like your people have big giant beards and swords.
Yeah, I feel like you got a bit of a Mike Bledsoe vibe going on.
I don't know who Mike Bledsoe. Who's that?
Oh, Barbell Shrugged.
Oh, okay, yeah. They I like the last time I listened to that show, there was like totally different people that were on it.
Oh yeah, no.
Like
So
years ago.
I'm talking like OG Barbell Shrugged.
Oh, okay, yeah.
6 or 7 years ago.
Yeah.
When Chris Moore, rest in peace, was still alive. It was awesome.
Yeah. Was it like a CrossFit one back then, or it felt like it?
Yeah, it was always a bit. So they ran a CrossFit gym, and then Chris had his own podcast called Barbell Buddha. You'd probably like that, actually.
Oh, I think I remember that one.
Yeah. There's some old episodes. They were always fun to listen to.
Well, I was always like, this is terrible. This just shows my bias. Like, I wouldn't listen to it because I just figured it was like an Ayn Rand reference, and I still hold a lot of animosity towards all the Rush fan libertarians. And so, two of my best friends in the world are like really, really big libertarians in economics. And like they're like my best. We have totally different like political viewpoints, and they're my best friends. So it's like so anytime anything, I'm like, oh Jesus, here comes. It's gonna be like college all over again. Listen to them in a room talking about and especially in the '90s in college, we were all like, no one really cared about politics that much because we were all screwed, and so everyone was kind of Marxist, and then like then my friends who were like super libertarian they just seemed completely insane. So So while we're jumping into politics, let's jump into something that seems to be gaining even more controversy today. I'm going to do an intro afterwards, but let's just start off because I want to make sure that like everyone understands your background, where you come from, because we're going to talk about whether or not we can really be healthy at every size and what that even really means. So I want them to, I think people are going to want to know your background because why do you even care about weight, food, brain, metabolic health? Like, so just like, I guess, give a background of where you came from, what you do now, and so we can kind of explain backstory here.
Yeah, sure. So I'm an MD PhD trained in the UK mainly, although I did my PhD in Norway. And most of my academic research is in brain injury, particularly neonatal brain injury, but also increasingly various traumatic and other brain injuries later in life. And alongside both my medical training and then my PhD, so I don't work clinically anymore because the process of getting a new medical license in the US was just so arduous that it just wasn't worth it. Although I take a financial hit on that every day, but that's fine. And yes, so I mainly do academic work, but alongside all of that, I've spent a lot of time working both in sort of industry startups, working with like coaching various athletes, biochemical, like in-depth biochemical testing and all this other kind of stuff, and taking what I would call more holistic approaches to long-term health and performance in that group, as well as in various chronic disease populations. And I helped found the British Society of Lifestyle Medicine I'm still one of their trustees. I'm associate editor for a new journal run by the academic publisher Wiley called Lifestyle Medicine. And so I'm kind of deeply entrenched in thinking about ways that the environment and our lifestyles affect our long-term health, and what's modifiable, what's not modifiable, what should we be saying is based on personal responsibility, which is probably not as much as most people would think, and what do we think is a societal responsibility, which is probably, for me, maybe most things that affect long-term health. And I'll just say straight up, I was brought up in the UK. I worked in the national healthcare system. It's healthcare free at the point of entry, as I think it should be. I'm a pretty card-carrying socialist, so may as well just say that up front. That's where a lot of my opinions are going to come from, and I may as well start saying this on podcasts, because when I then people listen to me on a podcast, then they follow me on Instagram, and then I post stuff which makes it very clear that I'm pro-science and a bit socialist, and then they stop following me. So, if you don't like that stuff, then don't follow me in the first place. I guess that's probably where we should start.
But I think this actually is a really good jumping off point, because I think when we talk about this idea of what is healthy, we deviate a lot of times from what we're talking about from a scientific standpoint, from data, from what we see in population studies. And it's very, very easy and very prolific within the fitness industry, in the non-medical fitness industry, which I see a lot, and actually even within medicine, that it deviates into, like you said, this personal responsibility thing, where it becomes a moral judgment. And so to make it very clear, you are on the point of saying, like, hey, this is a societal and environmental problem that also needs to be treated in that way. So when you talk about, like, hey, these are markers that I think might be where we see health go into dysregulation, this is not a moral argument. This is just saying, like, hey, this is what we know. And so I think that's a really important jumping off point to say to people, like, hey, this is not you just need to try harder, you need to be better. This is we as a society need to make inroads here. And so starting with that, what do we look at and say, hey, this is, maybe not a hard line in the sand, but there's probably a floor ceiling here of what we think of as healthy?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's important because of how you would approach things, both from a public health societal level as well as on an individual level. And it's worth saying, like, from the outset, and I've recently gotten embroiled in some of this stuff in the academic world, because people are increasingly against vast swathes of obesity research, because they think that when that gets into the media, gets onto social media, it's going to contribute to weight stigma, which is, abhorrent to me and certainly possible. But at the same time, we can't say, hang on a second, we shouldn't do obesity research because it's going to contribute to weight stigma, because actually it's very important to identify those at risk, to identify societal, systemic level changes that we can put in place to reduce risk overall, right? You're not using it to say this person individually should or shouldn't do this. The data is population data, and it should be used to inform population level interventions. And just there's a risk that people will take it the wrong way and it will get portrayed negatively in the media, and we should definitely address that. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing this research in the first place. And so when we think about, say, being overweight or obese, and it actually also works for underweight people as well, the output that I'm interested in the most is some degree of metabolic health, which is basically like how good is your body at processing energy. Really, that's what it comes down to. And there are various markers that we can use for this. It could be things like fasting blood sugar, fasting insulin. You can use those together, something called a HOMA-IR. Blood pressure is super important. Some lipid markers can be super important. This is all stuff that most doctors could do. And these are the things that are associated with downstream health outcomes. So there is an important point made by the HAES, or Health at Every Size community, which is that your BMI, your classification of whether you're overweight or obese, is a very poor predictor of your overall health. It's absolutely true. At a population level, the more excess adiposity you have, the more likely it is that you will have poor metabolic health. But they are not directly correlated. You can't say because somebody is obese they will have poor metabolic health. But that doesn't mean that BMI isn't useful. Again, at the population level, we really need to separate out what it is we're talking about. And so when you look at metabolic health in people who are obese, depending on how you classify it, somewhere between 7% and 50% of people with obesity have good metabolic health. And so the 50% is the absence of diagnosed metabolic syndrome. So metabolic syndrome diagnosed based on, again, lipids, blood pressure, blood sugar, waist circumference. And so 50% of people who are obese, they would hit the waist circumference target for metabolic syndrome, but wouldn't hit the other ones. So it hasn't actually affected things like their blood pressure and lipids and blood sugar significantly. And then if you go all the way down to the 7% of people who we might say are obese with good metabolic health, sorry, I just got a call that interrupted my thought. So the 7%, those are people who have a low HOMA-IR, so good low resting blood sugar and fasting blood sugar and low fasting insulin. It's worth bearing, so 7% doesn't sound like very much, but it's worth bearing in mind that overall in the US population, regardless of their BMI, I would say that it's probably not that many more percent of people who have really good metabolic health. It's definitely under 20% of all adults in the US have good metabolic health. Depending on how you measure it, maybe less than 10%. So, super prevalent, regardless of obesity. It's just that as you gain excess adiposity, the likelihood does increase.
Yeah, which is interesting because I saw this argument made on a Hayes. So, and just for clarification, Hayes health at every size or healthy at every size there's different determining factors. So I hate to lump everyone in together.
Yeah.
But I do because there's a lot of this movement that me in my personal practice I find value in really understanding weight stigma and to see that. But on the other hand, I saw one argument from kind of anti-diet person. And her argument was a very strange one to me, but it was like, hey, it was kind of a chicken and the egg thing. She was saying, is it the excess adiposity that is leading to the metabolic dysfunction, or is the metabolic dysfunction leading to the excess adiposity? And it was kind of like,
I think from the basic science, we're fairly certain it's the former. And I don't think there's really much argument there. I mean, if you look at the steps that lead to systemic insulin resistance, and again, using animal models, it's very difficult to do it in humans, but what you see is that once you reach some kind of personal limit, and so this is kind of like a theoretical framework just to think about it. Every person has a personal fat threshold, and once you start to reach that, then basically the signals coming out from the fat cells are like, can't take any more, can no longer act as a buffer for like caloric intake, and then that's when you start to see spillover that affects the liver, affects the rest of the body. So it definitely seems to be that the excess adiposity is a big factor driving that. However, the amount of fat that you need to gain as an individual to start to see that is hugely variable, and it depends both on some background and environmental factors, because oxidative stress and inflammation are super important. So if you're physically or psychologically stressed, you're exposed to a load of environmental toxins because of housing redlining that's put you near some refinery plant because of systemic racism meant that you couldn't buy a house anywhere else, or your family couldn't buy a house anywhere else. That's going to affect how much fat that you can gain before you start to see these problems. So I think it's definitely I definitely think of it as a fat-centric model, but there's all these other things that affect how big and healthy of a buffer that you have. But I think the science is reasonably well decided on that.
Which I think that then to kind of jump back into that public health model, the fact that personal fat threshold could be lowered by environmental, I mean, I'm assuming even epigenetic factors could factor into all this. I mean, we're really talking about a truly systemic problem that, again, I think the argument seems to live in this personal, individual basis, but we're not going to fix it like that. If we're actually lowering the bar for people who are already at risk and making it even harder.
Yeah. So if you look at so in the US, if you look at the amount of fat tissue that you can accumulate before you get type 2 diabetes, metabolic syndrome, white people seem to be able to gain more fat than black people. The problem is that when you think about it like that, it becomes extrapolated as there is a biological effect of being black that affects your personal fat threshold, which is 100% not true. There is no reason to think about it like that, and like there's no evidence to support that. There's no evidence to support a biological effect of blackness on health outcomes. It is a proxy for all these other things, housing insecurity and stress and systemic racism and like environmental exposures. Again, much worse in black and poorer communities because you've been shoved next to some kind of oil refinery or something like that. Like, all these things play a role. And then in the study, all you have to look at it is this person white or black? And it just gets completely misinterpreted because it's just a proxy for all this other stuff that's happening. And so that, but I still think that that's fairly good evidence, as much as we can have, to support that on a societal level. There are all these things that are driving our capacity to be able to handle this, these caloric insults, this caloric buffer that is then going to change our personal fat threshold, if we want to call it that, which then affects our long-term metabolic health. But it's absolutely happening on a societal level. It's not just because certain people are greedier or lazier, which is how it often gets portrayed.
Yeah, I mean, there's such a disconnect, and generally, I mean, I know that you kind of have a couple toes in the fitness industry, but luckily you're not knee deep in it quite as much as I am. So, because I mean, there's actually, I'm working on something now that's in my brain. I'm titling like, how many different ways can people in fitness call fat people lazy? And I don't think they even realize they do it, but my favorite is always like, it's cheap to eat healthy. You're just being lazy. And I'm like, you do realize, right, that people that might live in a food desert, or let's say that they're working two jobs because they make $7 an hour.
And they've got to pay for health insurance.
Sure. Right? And someone says, but you can cook beans and slow cook this thing. And I'm like, so you realize that they don't have 6 hours a day to sit and do all that. But it's this idea of like, it's just you. This is how we fix it, is you need to just stop being lazy. And they're saying, I'm not saying that. And it's like, you don't realize you're saying that because you're speaking from a place of not understanding. But this is again, it's really, it's why this stuff is so hard. It's so ingrained in our society. Now, within this personal fat threshold, I know this is probably going to be kind of, a logic jump here, but do you see anything that you think would be the big rocks that could go after to hopefully help raise that threshold?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and in reality, I think the rocks are often going to be like very similar. If we're talking like regardless of like the scenario, are we talking about long-term health? Are we talking about long-term performance? I think they're all very similar, right? So we think about like movement, right? And obviously this has to be predicated on the fact that somebody has the time and the capacity and the cognitive space to be able to add this stuff in and show it, and like that being like a part of, and again, that should be part of like this, like society, rather than saying you just have to move more. It's your own personal responsibility, right? I think we know we've created this obesogenic environment where nobody has to move, and right, that's a problem. And that only people with a certain amount of power and privilege can actually then build that in to their day, right? But the best example that I have, and so of where you can have quite significant excess adiposity and still be in good metabolic health is sumo wrestlers, right?
Yeah.
And I'm not likening the average US person to a sumo wrestler, but there's very nice data on the metabolic health of sumo wrestlers who have obviously very large subcutaneous adipose stores, train incredibly hard, and eat vast amounts of food. But because they're pushing so much through the system, they remain in very good metabolic health. They have good muscle mass, or exceptional muscle mass, as you know, as well as being in a high flux state, as you would call it. And so like they're really good at drawing large amounts of energy through the system. So that's one. But it could be you know, nutrient status. Super important, because there's lots of data to show that if you're deficient in certain nutrients, which again is going to be very common if you live in a food desert and all you've got is access to highly processed, refined fast foods, you know, individual nutrients, of which there are 5 or 10 at least, can affect like your oxidative stress status or inflammation status, which then is going to be expressed as, say, a reduction in your personal fat threshold, but also loads of other stuff, like, say, worsened immunity, which is going to increase your susceptibility to COVID-19, right? You know, like all of it is intimately interconnected. So nutrient status, movement, sleep and psychological stress, but then there's also systemic stress. So I mean, the problem is that these things are all the same, right? If you're ever going to talk to somebody about how to improve their overall health or their performance, you're going to talk about movement, diet and diet quality, sleep, stress, social connection, right? It's all the same stuff. So some of this, you know, you can address at the individual level, because you're going to have to find what's the lowest hanging fruit for this person that is probably going to be the thing that's affecting them the most, and is something that they can easily change. And then there's also going to be the societal level stuff that you'd have to do at the same time. But it's always going to be like, those rocks are always going to be the same rocks, and it's not particularly sexy, but that's what it always comes back down to.
Yeah, you know, it's the solutions are, unfortunately, like, it seems like the solutions are all the same, or I should say the steps towards the solution are all the same. It's how do we therefore try to implement them on a grand scope that is the actual problem. So a thing that keeps coming up here is inflammation. And I know among my clients, among the people I work with, it's kind of a buzzword and no one actually really knows what it means and just says it. So can we talk about inflammation, about what it is, what its role is, and why, and how we measure it?
Yeah, it's, again, a fabulous question. And the easiest way to think about inflammation to start with is, like, if you have an acute injury, right? Like there are the 4 cardinal signs of inflammation, which are rubor, calor, dolor, and one other one. But it's basically, that's Latin for swelling, redness, pain, and heat. Yes. So those are the 4. And so, like, that's what you'll see if you acutely injure yourself. And so, right, it's an important part of the healing process, right? It requires, you know, the immune system comes in, it clears out the debris, whatever's been injured, and then starts to, you know, repair and build stuff back in over time. And that's the job of the immune system. And it's the same thing, right? When you get sick, your symptoms, you know, fever, chills, muscle aches, all that kind of stuff, that is not the bug, the virus, or the bacteria that's causing the problem, right? It's your immune system responding to it. And again, that's important. You find the bug, clear whatever damage it caused, and then repair it. Now, the problem is, the kind of inflammation that we're talking about in this setting is like chronic inflammation that you can't really see that well, and because it happens at such a low level. And again, the problem comes from the fact that it's caused by something that, again, is continuously there, and it can be both like an actual exposure, so air pollution, you know, water pollution, like those are things that is going to be constantly in your environment, and they cause this chronic inflammatory response. Those are maybe some of the things that a large number of people are exposed to, and it's something that's very difficult for them to get rid of, because the problem is that if you don't get rid of the source, you're just going to get a continuous sort of low-level response to it. And when you ask about how we measure it, probably the easiest way that we might talk about is you do a blood test for something called CRP. C-reactive protein, maybe HSCRP, high sensitivity C-reactive protein. It's very easy to get. It's very cheap. And it gives you kind of like a sense of like how activated is the immune system right now. So like when you're responding to something, you produce what we call cytokines. These are the protein messengers that your immune system uses to communicate. One of those is interleukin 6, IL-6, goes to the liver, CRP is made, and you measure the CRP. And this could happen after a hard workout, could happen after a snake bite in the Costa Rican jungle, could happen after you're exposed to car fumes, right? It's non-specific. And we know that like the higher your CRP level, in general, increased risk for heart disease, certain cancers, type 2 diabetes, all this stuff kind of downstream of there. So we can measure it to a degree. The problem is that there are some things that we do to ourselves that cause an inflammatory response that we can't measure. So an example would be, and it's because the inflammation is happening at the tissue level, and if that tissue is deep inside your body, you can't get at it. And so the best example that I can think of is high volume, high intensity endurance exercise, which is associated long-term with scarring of the atria, which is the top part of the heart, which eventually leads to AFib. And if you try and create AFib in animal models, that's what you make them do. You make them go out and like run as hard as they can for an hour every day, which is what some people think is a healthy way to exercise. And over time, their heart becomes scarred in the rhythm making portions, and eventually they get AFib. The problem is that you can't measure that inflammation, that scarring, that injury in a blood test very well because it's happening at the tissue level. So there are some non-specific markers. CRP is probably the best and most easily accessible one, but unfortunately there are other things that could be going on that at the moment we're not that great at measuring. And you can do nowadays you do super fancy imaging. We're always trying to develop new biomarkers, but it's research based, they're expensive, they're not easily accessible, right? So with the tools that we have, CRP is probably one of the best things that we can use.
Yeah, and I think it's the double-edged sword of the inflammation talk is that it is vitally important to be aware of, like, that this is, systemic inflammation is something that can obviously lead to a lot of downstream negative effects. At the same time, just assuming you have inflammation because of some it's the thing I get a lot of is like, I must have a lot of inflammation. I had bread last night, and it's like, well, maybe.
Yeah.
but I don't know that I don't really know that the 2-pound weight gain overnight is because of systemic inflammation, or if it's just that you actually ate 2,000 extra calories.
Yeah.
Last night.
And then a lot, and most of it was carbohydrate, and a load of water came on board, and wait 6 hours, you'll pee it off, and all that will be gone. Yeah. So this is the problem, is that we assign these things to this stuff to kind of make it good or bad, right? A food is good or bad because it's inflammatory or pro-inflammatory, which is just 100% nonsense. Because so in an individual, some people don't tolerate gluten very well. I know a lot of people who would say no human should ever eat gluten. I don't agree with that. There are people who obviously have celiac disease. There are other people who have some kind of intolerance. I believe does exist to gluten. It's maybe maximum 10% of people, and maybe that's going to cause some kind of inflammatory response. But it doesn't make it good or bad. It just is what it is. I think overall, if you have a very poor dietary pattern, and that's going to include lots of refined carbohydrates, because big glucose spikes certainly can cause some kind of inflammatory response. Certain processed oils also seem to worsen inflammatory responses, and at the same time they tend to be nutrient deficient, which just means that you can't really handle this stuff properly because you don't have the minerals and nutrients cofactors for enzymes on board to help deal with this stuff. I think in general we could say that the standard American diet is a pro-inflammatory dietary pattern, but that doesn't then mean that I can say this food is good or bad because it causes inflammation or not.
So again, because and I will I'll do a little promo here. It's part of the. Some of these are leading questions because I having taken Tommy and Ben's blood work course, it's made me think a lot more about this stuff that I kind of honestly brushed off. because it was normally coming from people that like were just kind of making words up and putting it in there, but like actually seeing it from a medical model, from a clinical model, from a research model, it's made me say, okay, so if I can actually see it and it's actually like in my blood work, here's where I can actually take it and do something useful with it, instead of just like saying, oh, I feel like I have inflammation, so therefore this food is bad. And again, the idea that inflammation in and of itself is normally a positive thing because it's helping you to heal. So, like you said, kind of separating that. Now, we started talking.
I just wanted to like just attach onto that the massive importance of what we think on our physiology. And so when people are talking about this stuff, you're going to and you think you may be trying to do good, right? Don't eat gluten because it's pro-inflammatory and inflammation is bad, right? So what happens then is the people who listen to that and they internalize it, and people do, is they think, well, I ate this bread. It's pro-inflammatory. They create this negative thought process about it. That negative thought process is probably having a much bigger effect on their physiology than the bread was in the first place. And we have loads of examples of how we think about an exposure, like something we eat or our genetics. It can have a negative effect. It directly affects our physiology, and potentially more than the thing itself does. So when people talk like this, and they talk in this black and white way, and they say this is good or bad, this is inflammatory, pro-inflammatory, this will make you fat, whatever, this will make you shredded. I mean, you're causing direct harm because of the way you're changing like the way people think about this stuff. So like, it's really important to not do that.
I think that's such a huge thing that gets missed is physiology and psychology. People try to keep them so separate. But it reminds me, there's this great show. It's on Vice. It's called Hamilton's Pharmacopoeia. I don't know if you've seen it.
I've seen a couple of episodes.
Okay.
Of that, yeah.
So this guy's a chemist, and he he loves psychedelics. So but there's a scene where he goes to this big seminar about toad, which is like these toads that people milk and then smoke the thing. And he's basically like, all right, this is cool. Like, you guys like do this, but you're killing like basically an endangered species. And it's not, you guys are like all these hippies. He's like, we can make this stuff in a lab. He's like, I just made some yesterday. He's like, it's really easy. Like, and this guy says, well, I've done both. And I really feel like I get a different thing from when I squirt it out of this toad. Don't you think the soul of the toad has something to do with it? And so, like, just seeing this, like, this chemist, face just drop, and he just says, I've analyzed the chemical makeup, and he's like, I choose to live in an evidence-based world.
Yeah.
And it's just like seeing
I couldn't find any toad soul in my sample. So.
And he's like, just seeing his face, I'm like, I'm sure this is my face a lot of times when I'm talking to clients. But he's like, he's like, now I don't doubt that you feel differently because when you think about it and you assign those, like you said, you're assigning this view to it, then absolutely that maybe you feel, but from a chemical standpoint, you're not getting anything different. Like but what your brain can do is a whole other, I mean, considering it's a psychedelic drug on top of that, but it was just one of those moments. I'm watching it and I just laugh and I like rewind it and make my wife watch it like 3 times. Just that scene, this face just boom, and just going, okay, how do I answer this? And people still invite me to come back and talk to them about it. So in there, one of the things I wanted to jump into too is because of your background working, especially with traumatic brain injury, you fall a lot into a low carb, high fat camp because of obviously the effects that carbohydrates have on TBI, which is a whole fascinating topic in and of itself. But as far as for people who are potentially in this metabolic dysregulation, is there in your mind an advantage to a certain macronutrient profile for these people?
So yes and no. And there are short-term, like postprandial, like within a meal effects that are potentially important long-term if they're repeated multiple times. And then there are the long-term effects like on overall metabolic health. So we have a fairly good idea that the size of the peak of the glucose after your meal, which is like the amount of glucose, like blood sugar you suddenly have like circulating, can have an effect on a number of things, including like particularly the health of your arteries and your risk of of atherosclerosis, which is obviously the downstream cause or upstream cause of a heart attack. And so if you are somebody who is metabolically dysregulated, it's likely that for a given carbohydrate load, you will have a bigger spike in blood sugar. It's not guaranteed. And again, from person to person, different carbohydrate sources will cause different spikes. And there are some really nice papers, some older and some just coming out last year, that basically say that the amount of carbohydrate in a meal and the source of the carbohydrate, on a population level, maybe only tell you 20 to 50% of the actual glucose spike. Other than that, the rest is all like super individual and meal context and all this kind of stuff. So if you're interested in it, you have to kind of figure out which carbohydrate sources for me cause very large spikes. And sometimes it's not intuitive at all. Like the glycemic index, basically we need to throw it away. Doesn't mean anything. And so one of the best ways to minimize the spike in glucose after a meal is to not eat any carbohydrates. Absolutely. Shown very nicely by individually in a meal and the total area under the curve and total glucose spikes over the day. You just don't eat carbs, you don't get a big glucose spike. Right, so that's useful in that sort of short term. However, if you just restrict carbohydrates and nothing else changes, that's not going to automatically improve the overall health of your metabolism. What you're doing is basically symptom control in the setting of metabolic dysregulation. What you need in order to improve your metabolic health is usually either if it's driven by sort of exposures, inflammation, oxidative stress, personal fat threshold, all that, changing your personal fat threshold, all that kind of stuff, then you need to figure out what those are and get rid of them. Or again, on a population level, most likely you need to improve your body composition. And so your weight, I don't care about, but how much of it is body fat? How much of it is muscle mass? And if you can improve that, then the other stuff is going to improve. And when you look across every dietary intervention, every randomized controlled trial comparing different types of diets, different macronutrient contents, the amount that your metabolic health improves is directly proportional to the amount of body fat that you lost, and how you got there doesn't make any difference. So longer term, whatever it is that takes to improve that person's body composition, I don't think low carb versus any other diet is particularly beneficial, other than altering blood sugar dynamics in the short term. I personally am a big fan of lower carbohydrate approaches because the people that I know, and myself personally, obviously, I'm biased by my personal experience, it's just much more sustainable. And you also are more likely to get more nutrient-dense foods and more protein, which has a whole load of other benefits. So that doesn't mean that, but again, like I said, it doesn't matter how you do it. So however works for you to improve your body composition, and that's going to require some kind of caloric restriction, adequate protein, and probably resistance training to increase muscle mass. However you do that, I don't care. Like, that's what's going to be the most important thing to improve metabolic health. So short-term benefits, but longer term, it doesn't really matter. That's just you just got to get to that state.
It's funny you say that for you and for other people that you found it to be much more sustainable, because the argument from the other camp is always that low carb just isn't sustainable. And I think first of all, I don't know, maybe Ben sent me the study. This past week, someone sent a meta-analysis that showed that that adherence on almost every diet is pretty much across the board the same. There's not really a big difference when you look at it long-term and adherence levels. That said, because that's always the argument against low carb, is that people can't, and I think in my view, what was extrapolated from that was people were looking at keto and saying that like being in ketosis is not sustainable. You're going to have carbs. You're going to gain 5 pounds overnight, and it's like, well, maybe, but does that, if that's the case, does every single person that has a bunch of carbs one night gains that 5 pounds, then just give up and just start eating just rice for every? I mean, I don't think so. I think I'm way more malleable in my ideology about diets now than I used to be. Now I'm kind of like, I think it's probably just as sustainable for everyone. And I am actually, in personal bias, I am now on the Tommy Wood diet. I'm currently eating about 325 grams of protein a day, which honestly, it makes calorie control really easy.
Yeah.
I eat broccoli slaw, peppers and onions, and meat. And then I have rice around my workouts. And I'm full all the time. I mean, I'm still getting about 3,000 calories from just meat, but it creates its own kind of bumpers.
So this is the thing, and somebody I really like in this space is Dr. Ted Naiman. He's actually local to me. He's got a book and a website called the PE, the Protein to Energy Diet. So it's basically looking at foods by their protein content relative to their total caloric content, and beyond that is basically completely agnostic to what that food is.
Yeah.
And if you target a gram plus of protein per pound of body weight, and to hit that target, like, other stuff is just going to have to fall by the wayside, and immediately diet quality improves, satiety improves, and that's, I think, the one of the reasons why I think low carb is sustainable for me and for lots of other people is because you're much more likely to get protein rich foods. I'm not a big, like, unless you have particularly a neurological disorder which benefits from a certain level of ketones, I don't think keto in and of itself is particularly exciting or interesting. And that is very difficult to sustain because you've basically got to restrict protein as well as carbohydrates to get a certain level of ketosis, and you've basically got to slam like heavy cream to get like enough calories down the hatch. And like that, I agree, that is not sustainable for most people. And also pretty nutrient deficient. Like, there's nothing, like, it's really hard to get loads of really high quality nutrients on a very, very high fat diet. You have to work hard at that as well. So that's why it's sort of like reducing overall, particularly refined, but I mean, obviously I eat carbohydrates. I'm not on a ketogenic diet. I'm certainly lower carbohydrate than maybe like the average person. But, you know, taking it all the way, I think you can do that for certain medical conditions. Absolutely. If I got a TBI, immediately I'm going on a ketogenic diet.
Right.
But if you're just trying to maintain a certain body composition and overall health, then I think protein is your best target. And how the rest you get there, and doesn't really matter. The one caveat to that being that if you lower your carbohydrate intake, you probably have to increase your protein intake to get the same anabolic stimulus or the same retention of muscle mass. So some people do very well on relatively lower protein diets because they have low fat diets with a huge amount of carbohydrate in. And that works great for some people. It's just worth remembering that protein and carbohydrates are both insulinogenic, which is going to be protecting your muscle mass. And so if you have less carbohydrates, you probably need to, again, increase your protein intake to get the same sort of overall balance of muscle mass retention.
Well, just from an observational standpoint of people I work with, you know, I actually get into these battles personally with other practitioners at time, because they'll say, oh, you know, why are you trying to push this protein agenda on people if they just don't want to eat it? I was like, you know, because I know that this is the lever. This is the lever. First of all, I don't want them to lose muscle mass. And I know every time someone says to me, I can't eat this much, I'm like, you can. It's you don't want to eat the protein. You want to eat the fats and carbs. So a real easy way to change the behaviors is to change the availability of those things. And it's like, even if I can just get you for a couple of weeks to change your structure, your viewpoint, to be like, okay, I'm just going to focus on protein. Because like you said, once you get the protein in there, plus I'm, you know, saying, hey, we're going to get some vegetables in there, you crowd the other things out. And that doesn't mean they don't ever come back in, but it at least says like, hey, this is how I can build a sustainable diet. And then when I do go and have a cheeseburger on Friday night with my friends, like, it didn't just destroy my whole week. Like,
and this is again, you have to, right, this stuff is going to happen. And so there shouldn't be any like morality attached to it, right? Mm-hmm. So if like dietary patterns are what matter absolutely the most, rather than individual dietary events, right? So if you eat a certain way, 10, well, yeah, how many meals do you have a week? 21, assuming you have 3, right? Yeah. You eat that 20 meals out of the week, and then one meal just happens to, you know, to be off plan. Overall, it's probably going to balance out, especially as if you improve other aspects of your environment. So if you can, sleep and stress and movement, all these other things, you become much better at understanding and detecting satiety cues. And so one of the reasons why, when you just turn around and say, hey, obese people are just greedy and lazy, they have been put in an environment where pretty much all the inputs make it so that satiety cues don't work anymore, right? So then expecting them to somehow figure their way around that is going to be impossible. So if you can fix some of these environmental things, satiety cues become much better. They actually work like they're supposed to. And then, so say you have a massive cheeseburger and fries, or whatever, Friday night. On Saturday, you just won't be hungry, so you'll eat less, right? That's how caloric balance is supposed to work. But you have to be in an environment that allows satiety cues to do their job.
And interesting you say that, because we come back around to these other things. Then all of a sudden, your satiety cues are screwed. And so you're eating things that are probably leading to, inflammation. Maybe you're obese, so your sleep is poor, or you have apnea. So then we're talking further inflammation. Our sleep is crap, so then hormones are off. Satiety is worse again, and it's just like it's cyclical then, and it just keeps getting worse and worse. And again, that's why I think, and I'm not to simplify things too much, but saying there's a couple of, like you said, big levers, and I think protein, exercise, movement, sleep, they're not sexy, but man, if you can nail a few of those things, a lot of other stuff starts to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing that another thing that goes with the protein, I think, is the caloric density of the food, right? And we have some really nice data to suggest that if the food that you're eating, the meal that you eat, has more than 1.5 calories per gram on average, which is basically anything processed, refined carbohydrates, both refined carbohydrates, refined fats. Once you get over that threshold, satiety cues don't work anymore. And there was this really nice. Did you see the recent Kevin Hall paper where they compared a plant-based low-fat diet to an animal-based low-carb diet?
No.
So it's just got published in Nature Medicine this week. It's been out as a preprint for several months, so I'd seen it before. But basically, they took people and they 2 weeks on these two different diets: plant-based low-fat, animal-based low-carb. And you think it's going to be some kind of way to say, well, is plant-based versus animal-based better? But no, the way it was designed just made that completely impossible to determine because, right, if you put people on an animal-based low-carb diet, it's a ketogenic diet, and these guys were in ketosis, the calorie density of that diet was double what it was on the plant-based low-fat diet. 1.1 calories per gram under the threshold versus 2.2 calories per gram over the threshold. And the people on the low-carb diet ate more food because they're eating a more calorie-dense diet. It's got nothing to do whether it's made from animals or plants, right? And then all of a sudden they're like, well, here you go. You can't eat keto because you'll overeat. Yeah, that's because they're basically chowing down on fatty sausages and drinking heavy cream. Of course they're going to eat more. It's impossible to regulate that. So this is something that's super important. And again, I don't expect somebody to calculate how many calories per gram that their meal has, but as soon as you start to introduce sort of lean proteins and vegetables, automatically you're there, right? The magical things that fix that whole problem.
Well, it's you always hear this we need to go back to this or go back to that, and really the whole basis of this kind of and not even paleo, just 50 years ago diet is that there wasn't a very our diets weren't complicated. And me growing up, I ate probably the exact same way my dad ate, and my dad hates vegetables. We'll say that. And everyone in my family lives to 95 years old. They smoke, they drink, they eat really genetically, but he grew up, he hated vegetables. My brother's the same way. I didn't really enjoy them. But we always had some kind of vegetable, but we always had, our meals always looked the same. It was a starch, and we would call it a starch, a vegetable, and a meat. And it was mostly meat, but it was every night we had some kind of steak or chicken and that's how I still eat. And so it's just a very simple way to look at food, but it's kind of been lost. But it's also it seems that is kind of a real simple basis. If your meat is just, there's animal fat in there, don't put a slop of butter on top of it. You're probably going to be okay. Your vegetables, try again. And I think, it's always the additive thing of adding the butter that changes the density of the meal, like you said. And
so that's exactly how. So I think about my Icelandic family and my grandparents, and obviously eating with them, and that's exactly how it looked. And I often it's worth bearing in mind. I couldn't measure genetics and tell you whether you should eat a low carb or low fat diet. Though plenty of people will tell you that they can. That's garbage. If anybody sells you a nutrigenomics test, tell them where to go, because it's just complete BS. However, I think there is some data that talks about like where your ancestry is from, and then like potentially using that to inform what might be most sustainable for you, right? So if I think about I'm of Northern European descent. I have Scandinavian family. You ever try looking for a starchy carbohydrate in Norway in the winter, right? Not going to happen. So like maybe that's one of the reasons why I feel better on a lower carbohydrate diet, because there just aren't any carbohydrates in the highlands of Iceland, I promise you, other than a few berries in the summer. But people who live close to the equator, you can certainly, or whose families, recent ancestors live close to the equator, certainly will have had much more like greater availability of carbohydrates throughout the year. So like some of that is potentially useful to people. But yeah, I'm thinking like all of particularly the women on my Icelandic side of the family live well into their 90s, and like all they ate was essentially meat, and like maybe there's a cabbage or a root vegetable and some potatoes occasionally, but I mean that's it. My grandma started to make salads later in life because I think my mum told her that she should, and they were healthy. But I mean, by that point, she already had plenty of ancestors living, to 100 years old, and make it whether they ate salad or not.
Well, and that kind of ties into. I think it was Gav Fandara was talking about gut microbiome stuff, and how everyone says like, oh, you should eat kimchi, and she's like, yeah, kimchi's great if you're Korean and your gut microbiome. She's like, but if you're just like, it doesn't necessarily convey across all boundaries, and so it is kind of that like, hey, maybe don't use your genetics to determine anything, because most of us at this point genetically are mashed up.
Yeah, well, and that's true. And so like I can say now, right, Northern European versus Central African heritage, in 100 years' time, that may not even be relevant at all, right? And so this stuff is probably going to get more complicated over time as we become more, ethnically mixed, if you want to call it that, for want of a better word. But it is worth bearing in mind. I actually have a paper currently under review where we talk about the fact that a healthy gut can really derive supportive nutrients from almost any dietary pattern. So everybody's like, oh, you got to have fiber so that your bacteria can turn into short-chain fatty acids to support like gut function. Actually, if you eat a lot of protein, that protein can be fermented by different bacteria into other substrates, but that support gut health just as well. So actually, your gut, and which makes perfect sense, right? We have colonized the entire planet and been able to live with almost like as vast array of different dietary patterns as you could possibly imagine. So to think that like as we moved further north and sources of fiber became more scarce because like edible plants became more scarce, to suddenly think that our guts just fell apart and stopped working properly, like that's insane. So like the gut is super flexible in terms of its like what it can tolerate, and so we generate a lot of problems by like saying this is a healthy dietary pattern, this is food that creates a healthy gut microbiota, because I think we can show by the fact that we have such like a diverse colonization of the planet and different ancestral diets that just simply can't be true. But it's another simple story that creates a lot of problems.
That's pretty fast. Again, and back to that psychology versus physiology thing is by, it almost creates that fragile mindset of like, oh, well, if I eat this, then of course that explains why I didn't perform well, or why I didn't sleep well, or whatever it might be. This
is one of my favorite things to remind people of about, like, if you think about where humans have survived and thrived, the human body is fabulously robust and resilient and adaptable. You just have to, like, there are some things that are important, right, which we talked about in terms of stress and sleep and social connection and stuff. And like, if that stuff is in place as much as it can be, you can basically handle anything. And so like this negative self-talk that we create about this food being like good or bad, or this gut microbiota being good or bad, or these genetics being good or bad, all of that undoes like this incredible like physiological resilience that the human body has.
So I think really kind of to bring this back full circle, we really kind of delved into, which I think is awesome. I mean, we really got into stuff that I think is actually really applicable to real people as opposed to theoretical. Like, we can be healthier at different sizes. The odds are just not in our favor if we are carrying excess body fat.
Yeah, that's essentially what it is. Like the Hayes healthy every size movement makes a great point, well, two great points. One, that when we focus on weight, we create this sort of this stigma that has a negative effect on people's physiology, and their mental health. And to a certain, and like that's absolutely the case. And like when we get people to diet, or sort of we create this like focus on diet culture, particularly people who are susceptible or have a history of eating disorders, it can certainly have a negative effect on them. But then what that leads to is these false dichotomies, which is that because BMI isn't a perfect predictor of health, we shouldn't use it. Or because some people are negatively affected, like mentally when they diet, nobody should diet. Or because weight loss doesn't perfectly predict how much healthier you're going to be, nobody should lose weight. Like these, like you just can't, like those are the narratives that are created, but they're just not true. Like we have to accept that yes, both things are possible, but we look at data on a population level. So yes, as you have increased excess adiposity, your likelihood of good metabolic health does decrease. On an individual level, we can measure that. I think that should be something that's baked into the healthcare system. You shouldn't have to pay for it in a civilized society. I'm sorry. And then like this is where things become baked into, like that's a societal change factor. It's not like you shouldn't bear the brunt of that. This is something that we should do because we want a healthier society, which is cheaper overall, by the way. And then you'd have to pay less taxes maybe. So just because something is a big signal on a population level doesn't mean that then should directly affect what you do with an individual. And then the individual is all this other stuff. You figure out what is the lowest hanging fruit. What can this person do? What are they able to do? Like within their means, their environment. And again, like some people say, there's no point in focusing on weight because the most important factor in your health is your socioeconomic background and your environment. And yes, that's true, but there's also plenty of data to show that regardless of your socioeconomic status or background environment, certain lifestyle factors are still beneficial if they're in place. So like the problem with some of the statements that come out of a Hayes type approach are these false dichotomies, which like kind of separate us from being able to really do anything. And yes, like most of the stuff that you might recommend to somebody to improve their health are weight neutral, right? Exercise is a weight neutral thing. It's going to be metabolically beneficial in the short term, going to improve your cardiovascular health. It may long term improve body composition, may or may not, but in general, it's a weight neutral thing. But that doesn't mean that like body weight isn't important. And in the right scenario, focusing on that to try and improve that where it's affecting somebody's health, is still a tool that we should have in our toolbox.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the important thing we can state here is that it is not a moral issue. If anything, the morality comes from us as a society trying to help those who need the help the most. And I think sometimes within that movement, again, with the psychology, with the eating disorders, with things like that, that it looks like a very simple story because, again, most of the research up until about 2000 or so showed that diets were absolutely 100% psychologically negative. Ben and I went through this. Like, I went in there with that mindset myself. Like, I think dieting probably is psychologically negative. It doesn't pan out that is actually the case. No. Most of the research that I've come across from the last 10 years have found a positive correlation to self-monitoring, but only when people see results.
Yeah.
So, yes, if you feel like you are dieting and you feel like you're restricting and you feel like your life is worse because of what you're doing and you're not seeing those results, you are going to have a very negative view of dieting. If On the other hand, you see positive results and your health markers improve, and your if you're concerned about weight, your weight improves. All of a sudden, you view it as a positive. So I think that's a really important note.
There is some nice data on like cortisol, stress hormone levels in people based on their dietary restraint, which isn't correlated to actual their. So it's not like you restrain more and therefore you lose more weight and your cortisol goes up. It's a cognitive thing. So if you feel more restrained or that you're having to be more restrained, that's a stressful event. But actually, you don't lose more weight one way or another. So like creating these constraints and putting these stresses onto people does have like potentially have a negative effect. But if you find something that works for you and is sustainable, then yes, there actually seems to be a net benefit on mental health. Now, if I was going to argue with myself there, I'd say, well, that's because we're in a society that praises people who lose weight or look a certain way. Therefore, you know, these improvements in mental health are maybe just an expression of the society that they're within. But I can't prove that one way or another, right? What matters to me is how the person feels themselves. So if they feel, and we see like improvements in self-efficacy, like subjective quality of life, if that improves, all of that's going to have a beneficial psychological effect, which is also going to further improve long-term health, and that's in the end what I care about.
Right. And yeah, I have the inner battle myself because I say, you know, a lot of times I see like, oh, look at all these positive benefits of someone losing weight. And on the way down, there's so many positive reinforcements. Then there becomes the maintenance of someone who is now 100 pounds lighter. And in a 6 months or a year, nobody knows them as a 100 pounds heavier person. And there's no more of that dopamine hit of like, hey, you're so great. And what I see in a lot of people is a constant recycling of, hey, by the way, this is what I used to look like. This is what I used to look like. And then more difficulties maintaining. And it's like, ooh, okay, is this another cycle that we need to also... So I think the way in which you lose weight also does hold a lot of potential missteps. And again, that's why I, you know, back to our societal thing, mental health should also be a big part of our physical, emotional, dieting, all this stuff, you know, and unfortunately that's often overlooked in our healthcare system as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why, you know, if you're doing like one of those, I think one of those meta-analyses looking at the effect of weight loss on mental health, in fact, like it's beneficial only in those who are like seeking treatment or engaged in that process, right? So you have a coach or a healthcare professional or somebody who's working through it with you, right? So you have this kind of emotional support, like some kind of network to do that. Because like when you're just white knuckling it and doing it by yourself, and the data's super chaotic and you're not entirely sure what to do, of course that's going to have harm. But then, you know, again, this shouldn't be the person who can afford to pay $100 a week to see somebody to help support them through this. Right, this should be something that's baked into our healthcare system, and therefore, you know, first of all, the resources need to be available regardless of somebody's ability to pay for it, and then also people need to be trained to do that, right? Because most physicians are going to be completely useless in this process because they don't know anything. So, right. But again, this is a top down thing rather than a bottom up thing that needs to happen.
It's again, the more you try to simplify it, the more complex it becomes. Well, you know, Tommy, I really want to thank you for your time. This was awesome. It actually went kind of a different direction than I expected, but I think it was way better. It really, I feel like people. The whole purpose of starting this podcast, this is a brand new thing I'm doing, is really to help kind of connect people with professionals, you know, experts in their area. And I think too often there is this hierarchical separation of, you know, people see, oh, you know, he's a doctor, he's a PhD, he doesn't have anything for me. Like he's talking to, you know, above my head, But this was really broken down on a level I think that everyone can understand and at least see the benefits of these really complex things that are really scary, don't need to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's, I think one of the reasons why, again, this is a hard story to sell is that, I mean, you know, people know what the answers are. It's just then it requires, right? It requires, you know, none of this is a knowledge deficit problem. It's just that you need the the greater societal and environmental structures in place to allow these changes to happen. And so then if people take that knowledge away, then maybe we can start to change stuff and see a lot more benefit, like on a wider scale.
And if you guys are interested, if you're fitness professionals or anyone that's listening that's interested in learning more about this stuff, Tommy and Ben through BroResearch have this blood chemistry course, which is absolutely phenomenal. You will feel really stupid when you go through this stuff. I'm hoping the second time I go through it, I feel less stupid. But it really does kind of break some of these really, again, things that kind of seem esoteric and out of our reach, to at least understand them. And maybe when we look at these things at a population level, we can at least kind of be like, oh, okay, this makes sense why we need to hit these big rocks. Anywhere else that people should look for you so that they can go tell you and bitch about how you're promoting science as a double doctor?
Science and socialism. Yeah. At Dr. Tommy Wood on Instagram is probably where I don't post super frequently, but like sometimes there'll be like some big, philosophical post about science or data or something like that, and sometimes it'll just be like pictures of me working out in the gym or my dogs. So a nice mix when it happens.
Yeah, and as we drag him deeper into the fitness world and corrupt his academic soul, we'll get him. He'll be on Instagram every day with shirtless selfies soon enough. All right, Tommy.
Not the latter. Promise.
All right, thanks, Tommy. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. This is awesome.